This is the Lumix S9, which is a compact full-frame camera that was very controversial at launch, but it has actually developed into a really good option if you're looking for a rangefinder style camera for street photography. I shoot a lot of street, so I decided to buy one after I ended up shooting a lot of street on my Lumix S5 IIx, which isn't quite so suitable for that genre. Although I have accumulated a lot of cameras over the years, I don't actually buy cameras all that often. I tend to stick with my cameras for a very long time, and before I upgraded to my S5 IIx, I actually shot Canon cameras for a long time. Old Canons like the Canon 700D and also the Canon EOS M, and I'm talking about the original one from 2012, I believe. I shot those for like 10 years, so I tend to stick with my gear for a long time. I get emotionally attached to my gear. So new camera day doesn't happen very often in this house, also because I buy my cameras with my own money. I think about all my purchases very carefully. Also for the S9, I was looking at it very carefully. And I already watched all the launch videos when it first came out. And back then I decided that the camera wasn't for me because of little niggles like no viewfinder, no electronic shutter, and all of these little things that made the camera controversial at the time. These were big cons in my book, and I will speak about those things later in the video too. But well, in the end I decided to get one anyway, and today we'll be going out to test it out a bit. And by that I don't mean charts and tests and that sort of thing. I mean a real world street photography session, because I think it's actually quite impossible to tell from a spec sheet whether you're gonna like a camera or not. And with this camera, I think it's especially true because on paper it doesn't look like a camera that I would enjoy without a viewfinder, but in practice, I actually think it's quite a cool camera. So let's get into it. I got my first shot before I even had my GoPro running, and actually I find it really funny because it looks as if this man is walking an invisible dog. I really love such pictures. While heading into town, I actually walked past the big construction site that I've been documenting since they started work on a new neighborhood here. I always end up taking pictures of the progress whenever I walk past there, because it makes for quite striking black and white pictures. I was shooting the 18-40mm kit lens that I bought together with the S9, and although that's a bit bigger at the front, I could get it through the fence here. I'm not entirely sure why I'm taking these pictures, except that I feel constantly haunted by construction noise around here. But a lot of what I do could be considered documentary photography, and I think it might be quite nice to have a record of the neighborhood as it is being built, and then doing photography there too when it's finished, because it's actually not that far from here. The construction site is really quite big, so I kept walking past the edge on my way into town and kept snapping pictures. What I love about this picture is the girl walking in that little sliver of light on the right, and I really like that there are layers to it too and a background, although it's a nearly frontal picture. I headed to a square that I explored recently with my Canon 17-40mm lens, and I realized that I had missed something, namely this really odd handprint. The fingers are really long and totally remind me of the X-Files opening credits. Of course I had to take a picture of that. I was actually out at a time that is considered bad for photography. It was getting close to midday in June, so the sun was really harsh and created all these shadows. For black and white photography, that can actually work really well though, because you can use the shadows to direct the viewer's attention. Here I find the shadow a bit too close to the bench perhaps. With this picture it works much better because it creates this triangle of light at the center. I just about avoided intersections with the guy walking on the left. It would have been maybe slightly cleaner on his next step, but then his head would have been too close to the bench perhaps, so not an easy composition to nail. Did I mention the construction sites everywhere? This isn't part of the big construction site, by the way. It's just the usual madness that goes on around here. It's hard to find a single street without scaffolding or construction machinery. If some of these framings seem a little tight, it's because I had the lens extended to 40mm, which is at the moment my favorite focal length. But since I've been shooting with 35mm for 10 years, I end up a little too close perhaps. Getting closer can be nice sometimes, but then it can also be a little too tight if the streets aren't wide. With these shots, the 40mm actually worked out quite nicely, and this one seems right in the middle of the action too. The main shopping street isn't all that interesting because people are really just passing through, so I headed into a different direction next. With this picture, I find it funny that the woman looks as if she was on stilts. There wouldn't have been any other way to frame it without overlapping, and I think it worked out. Before we continue, let's talk a little bit about why I didn't buy the S9 earlier. The main reason why I chose the S5 IIx over the S9 2 years ago when I switched camera systems was actually the lack of viewfinder and also the lack of a mechanical shutter. And I also didn't really think that I would be using the camera for photos much. Before I got the S5 IIx, I actually shot a Leica M6 for 10 years, so only film. And I also shot a lot of medium format cameras and that sort of thing. So I was basically film only, and all the previous camera purchases that I had made for video actually didn't end up getting used for photos all that much. And I expected the same thing to happen with the S5 IIx. Turns out that I actually enjoyed shooting photos on this camera a lot too. So I was using that a lot. I even already made a video about why I often choose my Lumix over all my other cameras, and that includes a Leica, so that's really interesting. I just realized that the way I was shooting it lately actually made the form factor of the S5 IIx a little bit awkward. I actually shoot a lot from the hip, and for that the S5 IIx body form is a little bit obnoxious because it has this viewfinder, which is very helpful in many situations, but if you're shooting from the hip, it tends to poke you in the belly, and that's not very comfortable. So having a viewfinder in this case is more of a detriment than anything else. And also the grip is a bit awkward for shooting from the hip too. It's a bit too big, and it sort of hurts your wrist after a while if you point it up a little, and that you have to do so that you don't cut off heads if you're too close. So in the end, all the ergonomic factors that make the S5 IIx better for shooting from eye level are actually a hindrance if you're using it without a viewfinder and from the hip. So the S9 became a much more interesting choice for the style of shooting that I prefer for street photography, and surprisingly, it became a better option not to have a viewfinder, which is sort of upside down. For most of the stuff I shoot on the street, I don't actually need a viewfinder, and in the very few moments when I need it, well, I can usually also get away with the screen, even though it's not as comfortable. So it's perfectly doable, and there would be only more specific things for which I would need a viewfinder. That would be more like urban landscapes where I want to compose carefully and so on. But for that, I still have my Leica and my S5 IIx, so I'm all set, and this camera I can just use for street photography. So let's continue and see what else we can find. For a couple of pictures, I decided to switch to color, and it's pretty obvious why. That red wall is hard to resist, and the palettes on the left too. Then I headed into this little passageway here, because I wanted to see whether the lack of a mechanical shutter would cause me any issues. I turned the synchro scan on to sync it with the lights, and it seemed to do its job correctly, because the shutter defaulted to something like 1/50, which matches the electricity frequency here. And no, I didn't see any banding in any of these pictures, which is nice. This lower shutter speed even gave me some nice dynamic motion blur in this one, so it actually helped, because normally I just default to 1/500. In this one, I love how the girl just blends with everything else in the window display. She could just be another mannequin. And I honestly have no idea why there is a Buddha in the window either. Someone had lost her trousers too, which seems a bit of an odd thing to lose if you ask me. I just had to take a picture because I found it so weird. I camped out here for a bit to get this shot, and it was well worth it. It's really nice as a black and white picture, and I find it really interesting what the reflection is doing to the mannequin on the left. And the guy walking through the frame gives it a bit more interest. Now this one I really love. It's again tight because of the 40mm, but it also seems intimate that way, and the look of the child becomes more striking because it's closer. There's the tattoo of the guy too, and I didn't notice that in the moment because it was really just a split second that he had his arm up like that. I don't even mind that they're not centered in the frame, it's more dynamic that way, and the reflection of the zebra crossing in the door on the left adds something too, especially since the bars on the door are vertical rather than horizontal. Again, I headed away from the shopping street because I wanted to go towards the old town and use a shortcut. This was such a happy accident. I really didn't intend for it to be such a minimal composition, but the trails of the airplanes really make this work, especially with the plane in the upper left corner. If you know me, then you know that I love dogs. Of course, I couldn't resist this one, especially because I knew that the dress of the woman would work so well in black and white. In the old town, they were putting up decorations for the June fiestas, and I decided to snap a few pictures. The wide-angle zoom actually came in handy for this, and that's actually why this 18 to 40mm is a useful lens to have, even if you just leave it at 40mm most of the time, like I do. Then I headed somewhere where I've never been before, and there are still many such places in this town, because I tried not to over-photograph it to leave myself some new places to explore. In San Sebastian, where we lived before, I practically walked every street of the closest neighborhoods already in the first year after moving there, and that made it photographically a bit boring for me, because I like to explore. So in this place, I'm making sure not to exhaust my opportunities too quickly to keep things interesting for me. With this picture, it was all the red that attracted me to the scene, and of course the cone too. The green also really helps to make the reds pop. Not a spectacular picture, but I do like the reflection on the hood of the car at the front. As always, extremely difficult to find a place to record because people always talk so loudly and there are construction sites everywhere. Oh dear. I think I got some cool stuff. I'm not entirely sure, as always after a street photography session. It always feels like there wasn't quite enough. And maybe I've taken certain pictures before, or it always seems that way because human behavior is somewhat limited in scope. So at some point it becomes all samey. So I'm never quite sure whether I got anything, and I need to see the pictures on a big screen before I know. But I think this went all right. And I do believe that the 18 to 40 millimeter is actually an interesting lens for street photography. The autofocus seems sort of snappy. I'm not sure yet. I'm still a little confused about the autofocus modes on this camera, and well, it's new and the shutter is quite silent, so sometimes I'm not entirely sure whether I've taken the picture, but I think it's working all right so far. And recording myself on it is actually quite a lot more comfortable than on the S5 IIx. I can't really hold that for vlogging, and even with this one, I'm now feeling it in my wrist, and I guess that tells me I should just stop talking and continue with my photography. All right, talk to you later. At this point, I was getting a bit tired, and it was close to siesta time, which is when the street's empty and it becomes much easier to shoot urban landscapes than street photography. I only explored this little park for a short while, and I will probably go there again to see the rest at some point. Not anytime soon though, so that there's always something new to discover. Not sure what's down there, for example. This was the moment I decided that I was done for the day and turned off the GoPro. I kept shooting though, and on the way back home I got a few more shots that I really like. As you saw, I was actually a bit unsure while I was doing the shoot, because I don't chimp much while I'm out shooting, and then I don't really know what I get, and so yeah, I always have to wait until after the shoot when I see the pictures on the big screen to know whether I actually got anything, especially since I often shoot from the hip, and then it's hard to judge whether you even got what you wanted into the frame. I think I got some really nice pictures though, and I'm especially happy with this picture of this guy here with the dog, It's really fun. I actually have a picture where the guy's head isn't cut off, but I actually like this closer one a bit better because it's a little bit more mysterious and the attitude of the dog is so funny. A lot of people actually don't really like this 18 to 40 millimeter lens because of the variable aperture and because it is quite narrow. I mean, f4.5 to f6.3 is a bit tight in the aperture range, and you're not gonna get any creamy bokeh or anything like that with this lens. But I actually think that for street photography, it's a really cool lens. Often when I'm shooting with my Leica, I zone focus. So I will use ISO 400 film and then shoot somewhere between f5.6 and f16. So f6.3 is not that bad and narrow. It's actually quite useful for street photography, especially since I like it when there's also stuff going on in the background. So there's just more stuff in focus. And for some things, of course, you would want to have more shallow depth of field, but this lens can actually do a lot out on the street. So I like it for that. In my style of shooting, I actually had it all the way zoomed in at 40 millimeter, and I was treating it more like a prime because I really like the 40 millimeter focal range, and I only zoomed out if I wanted to get something into the frame that was a bit on the wider range. So with this picture I could actually get the guy looking up, but otherwise I was mostly at 40 millimeter, and it's so convenient that I can just zoom in and know exactly where I end up, which is 40 millimeters. I usually shoot at 35 millimeters or 40 millimeters, and with most zoom lenses that's somewhere in the middle of the range because they go up to 55 or 60 or whatever. And then you don't really know exactly where 35 is without looking at the lens. With this one, I can just zoom all the way in and I know I'm at 40 millimeters, which is really cool. I don't really have anything much to say about the autofocus except that it worked and that I didn't have any problems with it. No missed shots, so I would say it's a little more reliable than the TTArtisan 40mm lens, which I often shoot on my Lumix S5 IIx. And there I sometimes miss shots because the autofocus is a little slow. So maybe it's quite nice if I shoot it as a 40mm prime in a way. But of course here the problem is that it's actually not as small because, I mean, like this collapsed is actually small, but you have to activate it and then it's out here, and that's not that small, I have to say. I think the TTArtisan lens is a little bit smaller and it looks a little less wonky too, because this looks weird. Especially if you also have an ND filter on it, it starts looking a bit strange. So would I recommend getting this kit lens? Yes, definitely in the kit. If you buy it separately, I think the price is a bit steep if you buy it new. On NPB you can find it a little bit cheaper, and that's more appropriate, but it's the cheapest if you buy it in the kit, and definitely worth getting just for the versatility, and you can also use it for vlogging and that sort of thing. For vlogging I actually find it a little bit tight because I like to have the image stabilization high, and then it's getting a bit close. So for that, maybe a 16mm would be even better. But I think I can get away with it in this case. I can also not set the image stabilization so high and then maybe do something in post too. But I think it's actually quite nice for that purpose too. And in general, I'm really quite happy with the video that I got from this lens too. It fits really well with the GoPro footage because of the narrow aperture, and I also think that the quality is quite nice. Maybe a little bit too sharp perhaps, so I like it a little bit more with a mist filter, but I do think I'm getting quite nice results from it, and I'm happy that I got this lens. As for the camera itself, I really don't have much to say about it because it is just so familiar for me. It is the S5 IIx in a slightly smaller body, and that makes it really fun. I have it set up in the exact same way, so it's super familiar. I can shoot video in the same way, I can shoot photos in the same way, and I just feel right at home. Did I miss the viewfinder? Well, no, actually, I have to say, because not once have I smacked the camera into my head so far because I expected it to have a viewfinder when it doesn't. So I guess I'm already used to it in that respect. And for my street photography, I really don't use the viewfinder that much anyway. I shoot a lot of stuff from the hip, so I don't really need a viewfinder for that. And then the rest of the stuff that I'm doing, the screen is just fine. I mean, you saw me, I was wearing sunglasses and I could see the screen just fine. And that was in like Spanish glare. So if you can't see the screen, and maybe that's more of an eyesight problem than a screen problem. And that's understandable too. For such situations, a viewfinder is better. I already mentioned that I find the electronic shutter a little bit too silent, I suppose. It's a very quiet camera, very stealthy in that respect, which is good in a way, but sometimes I'm struggling a bit to know whether I actually took the shot or not. And I do think that I feel it now when I take the shot, but I don't feel the shutter, obviously. It must be the IBIS perhaps that I feel. And yeah, I guess I'm getting used to it, but I'm more used to having like a proper feedback from the camera, like a proper shutter sound. I have the shutter sound activated on this, but on the lowest setting, you don't really hear it when there's street noise. So that's quite interesting too. It's super stealthy. I also didn't have any problems with the electronic shutter and banding. I was going through this passage, shopping passage or whatever it was, and the light there didn't make any problems for me. I also used a synchro scan and that actually worked really well. Of course, I don't know yet what the rolling shutter is like. I haven't tried to shoot out of a moving train or something like that. Probably not the best camera for that purpose, but on the street you will have a bit of a hard time finding a subject that will actually cause issues there, unless, you know, you're trying to do panning shots of moving things. That could be a bit more difficult perhaps. But then if you already know that about your camera, then maybe don't try. So I can just use the S5 IIx for those kinds of shots, so I don't really have to use the S9 for it. Is this the perfect camera? No, probably not. I mean, I would also prefer it if it had a viewfinder, and I would prefer it if it had a mechanical shutter, but I can live without these things. And if I really wanted to get the perfect camera, then I would probably save up for a digital Leica, because I shoot Leica on film and that's really what I like and how I like to focus. So in this case, I'm making compromises because the price is so much cheaper. And for the price, this is the perfect camera, I would say, at least for me. And I think that's always the caveat with all cameras. You have to find a camera that fits your style of working, and your style might be a lot different from mine. If you always shoot with a viewfinder, this camera might not be for you. But if you're like me and like shooting from the hip, this is actually pretty cool. And for the price especially. So you will be seeing much more of this camera on the channel, and not much will be changing since it's almost the same camera as the S5 IIx, just without a viewfinder, and the image quality is going to be the same, and I'm just going to have a better ergonomic experience, so to speak. But I will also be still shooting the S5 IIx, of course, whenever I want to use a viewfinder, and also my Leica on film, of course, that will also be staying, and everything else too, my medium format cameras and so on. This will just be my street photography camera because it really has the perfect ergonomics for that in an autofocus camera. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. It really helps out my channel, so I would really appreciate it. And in this case, I would suggest that you subscribe to my photography channel, because this is where these videos live, and I just post them to the main channel too, so that they get the widest possible reach. A big shout out also to all my Ko-fi supporters. You make all this possible and I'm really grateful for it. If you also want to support what I do, then you can head over to Ko-fi, or maybe just watch another video. There's actually an entire photography playlist that you can watch here. And I hope I see you soon for another video. Bye!